Hi, good morning. I'm going to keep reading Dolly. We're on to the first chapter. I did the introduction last night. That was after driving a lot, so. My reading was a little choppy. But it's good to get to know me. Okay, so we're reading The Faith of Dolly Parton by Dudley Delffs, a dear friend's father. It's a venture apparently into Dolly's Christianity, which I know little about, so thankful to learn how she names reality. This chapter, first chapter, is called Dream Your Way Forward. In the midst of the In the midst of the direst poverty and despair, the human spirit, especially that of children, will find some hope to cling to, some promise of a better day. Dolly Parton. I'll never forget the first time I saw Dolly Parton. I was probably about 6 at the time, sprawled on the carpet of our family room, the den as we called it, arranging green army men among plastic farm animals and matchbox cars, while my parents watched shows on the large oak veneer RCA console, angled in the corner. Our viewing skewed toward my father's favorites, or shows considered appropriate for our family, which basically meant to me as the only kid in the house and my parents' only child together, which basically meant me. Dudley Delffs, only child. The same show always seemed to be on. Staples like The Andy Griffith Show and Gunsmoke, along with Bonanza, Mannix, and Hawaii Five-O. 2 country music shows, however, stood out. The Porter Wagner Show and Hee Haw. While my father loved country music, these programs didn't interest me much. Some of the music was okay, even good sometimes, but the country cornball humor annoyed me. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but the corny jokes and predictable routines puzzled me. They were goofy and silly, playing up stereotypes that even as a kid I found over the top and limiting, if not insulting. My father tended to laugh, especially if he was on the 3rd or 4th drink, and my mother would grin or chuckle, usually following his lead. Despite my usual disinterest in what my dad was watching, one person on the Porter Wagner show always drew my attention. I know it's easy to assume that I was fascinated by her extraordinary figure and frothy blonde hair sculpted like cotton candy. And maybe I was. But there was something special about Dolly Parton. I couldn't have put it into words then, but it was more than just the fact she was young and pretty and had big breasts. It was even more than her beautiful voice that reminded me of birdsong. Sometimes bright and chipper like a robin, and other times as lonesome and sad as a whippoorwill. Yes, Dolly had for a lack of better words, presence. That mysterious star quality exuding from certain people who seem more alive, more aware, more positive, basically just more. Many of these larger than life people are entertainers, performers, and celebrities, but many wait tables, manage retail stores, or repair computers. I suspect Dolly would still be Dolly if she were a bank teller, a soccer mom. Now there's an image, or an attorney. Whether performing a duet with Porter or pretending to be a dumb blonde in hillbilly skits, Dolly seemed both smart and sincere. She didn't mind poking fun at country stereotypes because she was in on the joke. She was self-aware enough to deliver a punchline that with that tinkling bell laugh of hers, and then emotionally intense enough to beg Jolene not to take her man, and mean it. The fact that she wrote many of her own songs, only reinforced my impression that she was not like every other performer or country music singer. Simply put, Dolly was special. Humble beginnings. Dolly's origins have become the Smoky Mountain mythology her brand is built on. She has always joked about it. Sure, we had running water when we'd run and get it, but the reality must have been severe. Working their small farmstead from a 2-room cabin in the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, her parents, Lee and Avie Lee Parton, focused on keeping food on the table and roof over the head of their growing family. They were so poor that the local doctor who delivered Dolly, Dr. Robert Thomas, received a pound of cornmeal as payment. One of Dolly's earliest biographers, Alana Nash, then a journalist for the Country Music magazine, visited the old Parton cabin and wrote, "No matter how many pictures you have seen or how much you have fantasized about it, you are not prepared. It is the most extreme rural poverty imaginable, drier even than Dolly has painted it. And as you stand there gazing at the ancient washing machine on the porch and the inoperative still off to the side of the house, in front of the rusted automobile parts, and the scraggly chickens, you feel guilty for having wondered if Dolly was exaggerating her humble origins." Dolly's father raised a bit of tobacco as a cash crop, tended the family's vegetable garden, and worked construction and odd jobs in nearby Sevierville and Knoxville to keep his family going. Mama Parton stayed home with their young children, keeping them all clothed and fed while often expecting their next one. Early on, she disguised their poverty through her imagination, teaching Dolly and her siblings how to make stone soup, returning, turning a meager broth with potatoes and a few vegetables into a magical meal. By virtually all accounts, Dolly was a happy, carefree child, usually running barefoot in the swept, dirt-packed yard, chasing after chickens or listening to her mama tell Bible stories from the teeny front porch. She had older siblings to play with and younger ones to chase after. Nonetheless, as the fourth of 12 children, Dolly also realized early on that her parents simply didn't have the time or energy to devote to each child's specific preferences, talents, and personality. Dad and Mama had so many kids that none of us got special attention. But what they did have, she always quick to add, is plenty of love. Dolly and her siblings knew what being in a loving family was all about, and Dolly quickly found a way to stand out. Music became her natural means of expression, a shared language that commanded the attention of her family, friends, and neighbors. Whether at home doing chores, worshiping at church, or performing at school, Dolly's sunny smile and crystal clear voice could not be ignored. Even before she was born, Dolly was surrounded by music. Her mother frequently sang hymns and old mountain folk songs to her children while cooking, doing chores, and sewing by the fire. Her maternal grandfather, Reverend Jack Owens, was a Pentecostal preacher, so Dolly was exposed to more hymns and church music in the teeny mountain church where he preached. She was singing in church by age 6 and playing a guitar by 7. And it wasn't just to get others' attentions. Writing songs and singing was so as natural to Dolly as breathing in the fresh mountain air. She made up little melodies for as long as she can remember, with Little Teeny Tasseltop, a song about a beloved corncob doll her mama made for her. Being the first song she ever wrote, young Dolly noticed that the natural rhythms around her, while growing up, the two notes of a bob white, the sound of her mother, snapping beans, the tap 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 of a spoon on a cup, and found herself humming and riffing throughout the day. Dolly knew she loved music and never thought about whether it was practical. With the joyful assurance of a child doing something she loves, Dolly never questioned her attraction for words set to music. She just seemed to know that songs and singing were part of who she was, part of who God made her to be. Dolly enlisted her siblings, especially her sisters, to join in her performances too. She even joked that her sisters were musically abused by Dolly's attempts to make them her backup singers. But she would perform even when she couldn't find an audience. Well, at least a human audience. In her biography, Dolly, My Life and Other Unfinished Business, Dolly recalls how she'd stand on her front porch, grab a broom handle or a tobacco stack to use as her microphone, and sing her heart out to hens, roosters, ducks, and pigs roaming in the yard. she wrote. They didn't applaud much, but with the aid of a little corn, they could be counted on to hang around for a while. Her little old chapel. With no formal training or professional instruments, Dolly still managed to practice her songwriting and singing skills daily. When she was around 12, she began to regularly visit an abandoned chapel in the mountain community not far from her home. There she discovered a kind of sacred space to think about herself, her life, her dreams, and her faith. She also discovered an old busted piano. Keeping the loose ivory tops of keys as treasures, Dolly also took some of the piano strings and fastened them to an old mandolin she'd found in her family's barn. She described the results as sounding more like a dulcimer than anything else, but she used this improvised instrument to write many of her early songs. Curiously enough, this deserted, run-down little church became a kind of Pandora's box for a girl on the cusp of becoming a woman, for in it her three passions, or three mysteries as she described them, collided and converged: God, music, and sex. In her autobiography, Dolly described how this little chapel became the place where she reflected on her growing attraction to boys, aided by some graphic graffiti left by some of her peers, as well as the place where she met God at a deep personal level. Dolly had plenty of exposures to matters of Christian faith by this point. After all, her grandfather was a preacher and her mother was a devoted religious woman. Dolly witnessed the way her faith worked for them, but the notion of God as an angry old man throwing lightning bolts down at sinners that she'd heard about in Sunday school and in her grandpa's sermons didn't appeal to her. Dolly describes herself as the ultimate nightmare for fundamentalist Christians out to save souls. I was a kid with her own opinion, she explains. Like everything else in my life, I found God in my own unique way. Coupling her contrary nature with the unique mix of curiosity and embarrassment most of us experience going into adolescence, Dolly struggled to understand why Christians seemed to condemn something as powerful and natural as physical attraction and sexual feelings. She grew up on a farm in a rural community and had seen plenty of animals coupling and bearing their young. It was just part of the cycle of life. She was also keenly aware of her own developing body and the increased attention she was receiving from boys, especially at church. Apparently, it was no accident that lots of local boys showed up on the Sunday Dolly on the Sunday Dolly was baptized. Drawn more by the image of her rising from the